Hi everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining me today. This is a recording of a presentation I delivered on January 9th, 2025 on the Flagstaff Code Analysis Project. I'll kick off with an introduction for those who don't already know me. My name is Tyler Denham. I'm a resident of the Southside neighborhood here in Flagstaff. When I'm not giving PowerPoint presentations, I work as a data analyst for a medical device manufacturing company, and my academic background is in engineering and economics. A fun fact about myself, I speak Brazilian Portuguese, although with a very thick American accent. And the short version of why I got involved in local advocacy is several of my friends, family members, and coworkers were priced out of Flagstaff in the 2018 to 2021 period. A large part of my social network was shredded, which was quite upsetting. That led me to investigate why housing costs are so high and rising, which turned out to be the mother of all rabbit holes, as I'm still falling down it 4 years later. Also, a short disclaimer, I wear quite a few hats around town. I sit on the Flagstaff Housing Commission and lead a nonprofit. This presentation and the ideas therein are all coming from me personally. They aren't necessarily the positions of any of those organizations. I really struggled with how to start the presentation in a way that wasn't cheesy, but then I realized I'm a cheesy person at heart, and I should stay true to myself. So to start, I have a quote from the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Man is by nature a social animal. From the dawn of prehistory to our modern day, people have always banded together into groups, something that much of our earliest recorded history muses over. The tendency of humans to congregate together and form complex societies was viewed as something quintessential to ourselves. Because of this, cities arose extremely early in human history. Anywhere groups of humans were staying, cities emerged as a survival tool. Even groups in the Americas, commonly thought of as nomadic, had settlements they would travel between throughout the year. Cities provided shelter, they were defensible, you could store large amounts of food and water for lean times, and they were a common point for trade. You can view some of this history right here in northern Arizona. The top left settlement is at Walnut Canyon National Monument and built by the Sinagua people. The top right is a Wupatki National Monument and was built and added onto by the Sinagua, Kohonina, and Kayenta Anasazi people. These settlements are a fascinating reflection of local materials and the environmental conditions the ancestral peoples of Arizona dealt with. Of course, in our current age of material abundance, our cities are less a reflection of survival concerns and more a reflection of our values, like who can afford to live in our city? Can residents easily access open space and recreation opportunities? Can residents who can't drive easily navigate our city? Are public spaces safe and pleasant to visit? How vulnerable are residents to wildfire, flooding, or extreme temperatures? And so on. As for what values Flagstaff would like to embody, we actually have a good grasp on that. The city regularly conducts public engagement and surveys on important topics, and the results end up in various plans that are voted on by residents or their elected representatives. They lay out, to varying degrees of detail, how we'd like our city to be. And though some specifics may be hotly debated, at a high level they embody values that are quite anodyne that almost anyone would agree with. Things like residents of all income levels should be able to find housing that is affordable and fits their life circumstances. The city should minimize its environmental footprint and take precautions against probable risks. Residents should have a lot of choice in how they get around the city. Our city should be economically resilient, safe, and beautiful. Yet despite these clear goals, I reckon there is near universal sentiment that the past few decades of development are not reflective of Flagstaff's values. We build too little housing, as indicated by rising costs, but also the wrong kind of housing, with an emphasis on luxury products. Even when we get housing targeted at the lower end of the market, it often has poor connectivity, amenities, and design elements that undercut other city goals around things like sustainability and active transportation. A lot of our housing is also done at large scale by large developers. We get a lot of multifamily developments that take up entire city blocks, like the 88,000 square foot development on the left, and multi-acre suburbs like on the right. We don't enable smaller scale projects that are naturally the purview of small local developers and residents, depriving them of the opportunity to invest in our city. There remains a persistent gap between the number of people living in and around the urban core versus outlying areas. And if anything, this gap has increased since the passage of the Flagstaff Carbon Neutrality Plan. This gap drives a lot of additional greenhouse gas emissions as people in those outlying areas are much more dependent on single occupant vehicles, and transportation makes up 40% of Flagstaff's overall emissions. People in those outlying areas are also more vulnerable to wildfires, which has been reflected in recent insurance rate hikes so steep they were discussed before City Council as a homeowner's insurance crisis. At this point of the January 9th event, I paused for a group discussion to hear the audience's thoughts on how the past years of development have fallen short of Flagstaff's values. For those watching this recording, I encourage you to pause and consider the same question before continuing. As is clear from the discussion, there is a large difference between the types of development Flagstaff would like to see, as indicated by our collective values outlined in various plans, and the development it actually gets. The big question is, why? Well, a big reason is that the Flagstaff city codes, like the zoning and subdivision code, building and fire code, and engineering standards, do not embody those collective values. And these codes, far more so than our plans, are what actually determine what development looks like. The codes are where the rubber meets the road of land use policy, and they haven't been updated to match our values. Which brings me to the City of Flagstaff Code Analysis Project, or CAP for short. The city is well aware of the shortcomings of its current codes and has kicked off this project with the help of a consulting group, Cascadia Partners, to analyze and identify barriers so that reforms can be brought to City Council for a vote. This project is crucially important to Flagstaff's future, so much so it motivated me to create this presentation. And in this presentation, there are 4 things I want to do. The first is discuss the background and need for the CAP. That's the part we just did, by the way, so we're done with that. The second is provide information on the project timeline and public engagement opportunities. Third, I want to highlight a handful of particularly impactful reforms that may be considered as part of the CAP. And finally, discuss setting up a working group with interested Flagstaff residents. Let's start with the project timeline, as it's a quick item to cover. The CAP is broken into 3 stages: a diagnostic stage, a concepts development stage, and a recommendations and implementation stage. The diagnostic stage aimed to identify and evaluate barriers, opportunities, and conflicts in our city codes. This stage completed in June of 2024, when the Development Code Diagnostic Report was published. I highly recommend reading that report, by the way. It's very well done and covers many more topics than I have time to touch on tonight. The concept development stage is to develop concepts and approaches for code updates, to fix the issues identified in the diagnostic stage. This is the stage we're in right now, and the deliverable for it will be a code concepts report that details all of the planned code changes. A draft of this report will be reviewed by City Council February 4th, 2025, and the final version will go up for approval in June. After the code concepts report is finalized, city staff will start bringing ordinances to City Council to enact actual code changes, and this will carry on throughout the fall and winter and probably into the spring of next year. There will be public engagement opportunities spread throughout this timeline, though in my experience, to maximize your impact, you'll want to engage early in the process. Now on to the next section, highlighting a few potential reforms. I want to do this to give you an idea of the types of reforms to expect from the CAP. This list is not exhaustive. I just picked an example from each of the 3 categories of city codes: zoning and subdivision, building and fire, and engineering standards, from the initial Development Code Diagnostic Report. I also included a bonus section on parking reform. In the January 9th event, we ran out of time and weren't able to cover it, but for this recording, I will go through those slides. But for now, I'll dive into the top of the list: changes to the zoning and subdivision codes to encourage starter homes and missing middle housing. Although I should define my terms first. Starter homes refers to small, affordable units that are often the first step into homeownership by young people, thus the moniker starter. They're also convenient for empty nesters and older residents looking to downsize, but ender homes isn't quite as pithy. Starter homes used to be common, but became increasingly rare due to a trend called housing inflation. Over the past several decades, the average size of new single-family homes increased such that the average home built today is twice the size of that built in the 1960s. This contributes to rising housing costs, as bigger homes are naturally more expensive. Ironically, this trend coincided with a decrease in average household size, so we are building more house for less people now. Interestingly, Flagstaff is already dabbling with the concept of starter homes. The Townsite Community Land Trust is a local nonprofit led by Duffy Westheimer, working to preserve historic properties and make them available to residents at below market rate cost. Their portfolio includes some of the last remaining examples of pre-1960 starter homes, including 2 units on Bonito Street that are around 650 square feet in size and on lots around 2,500 square feet. As a mirror to that, Habitat for Humanity of Northern Arizona, led by Eric Wolverton, is piloting the construction of new starter homes, modest-sized efficiency units of 500 square feet on small plots of land. You can see the first 2 units they built at the corner of East Butler Avenue and South O'Leary Street, and they have another 40 units in the pipeline. In a way, the effort to bring back starter homes through the CAP is just the application of lessons already learned through programs like these 2. Missing middle housing refers to housing types whose density falls in between detached single-family homes on the low end and mid-rise apartments on the high end. It includes things like plexes, townhomes, and cottage courts. It's referred to as missing because, like starter homes, these housing types have disappeared over the past half-century. You can see that here in this chart of multifamily housing completions in the 2 to 9 unit range, the bucket that most missing middle housing falls into. We're building a tenth of what we used to before the 1980s. And this chart is just raw completions, by the way. It looks worse if you adjust for increasing population, as the decline in per capita completions is even steeper. There are many reasons to support more starter home and missing middle housing development. The obvious one is affordability. Starter homes and missing middle are usually more attainable because of their modest size and the way in which they spread land costs across more units. Where land costs aren't too high, missing middle can even be more affordable than apartments because it uses cheaper construction techniques. Both of them allow for a more compact urban form, which plays into co-locating more people next to amenities to reduce transportation greenhouse gas emissions. That compact urban form also means they are more financially resilient than large single-family homes, as they incur less infrastructure costs per resident. Both are more energy efficient than large single-family homes by dint of their modest size. A smaller footprint means less power for heating, cooling, and lighting. And it helps keep more land around and outside Flagstaff undeveloped. Both readily fit into more locations where there aren't large tracts of available land. This makes it easier to disperse housing throughout the whole city instead of concentrating it in certain neighborhoods. And relatedly, starter homes and missing middle housing projects can make it easier for residents and local developers to invest in the community. Larger developers are less inclined to get into small-scale projects. Now, encouraging starter homes and missing middle housing is a bit vague on the zoning and subdivision code changes required. Instead of a single section that needs updated, there's a web of regulations that make these things difficult to build. Minimum lot sizes, minimum setbacks, lot coverage requirements, and density limits all inflate the amount of land needed to build. Some missing middle housing types have a relatively narrow and tall profile, which can run afoul of floor area ratios. The goal is to get a lot of this housing as infill, which will likely require lot splitting, so we need to address hurdles there. And in many parts of Flagstaff, missing middle housing types bigger than a duplex are explicitly prohibited. This was another moment for discussion with the audience at the January 9th event. If you're watching this recording, I encourage you to pause and reflect on your own thoughts around encouraging starter homes and missing middle housing. Next up is a change to the building and fire code to allow point access blocks, also known as single stair buildings. These types of buildings are most common outside the US. If you've ever traveled or just watched films or looked at pictures of cities in other countries, you've probably noticed that multifamily developments look different. In other countries, you'll see a lot of buildings that are relatively skinny compared to their height. This narrowness allows many different buildings to fit on a single city block, creating a lot of visual variety. Multifamily buildings in the US, in contrast, tend to be very wide in relation to their height and take up a large area, often the space of an entire city block, like this recent development on Butler Avenue. Somewhat ironically, these large buildings are then subject to complex design requirements, like multiple facade materials and levels of articulation, in an attempt to break up the massing of the building and mimic the visual variety of the prior photo. When residents get mad over the idea of more multifamily housing development in Flagstaff, it's probably because they're imagining this style of building instead of the latter. There are a couple reasons why this style of large-scale development dominates in the US, and a big one is that most of our cities adhere to a building code that requires multifamily over 3 stories to have a double-loaded corridor, aka multiple stairwells with separate exits a minimum distance apart. This necessitates a central corridor that cuts through the middle of the building, which has several downstream impacts. First, it means you can't build multifamily on a small, narrow lot. You need a larger area to make up for the floor plate inefficiency. Second, it limits cross-ventilation and access to natural lighting for most units. Third, it makes it hard to include family-sized units because there's only 1, 2 if you have a corner unit, walls that can have a window, and you typically want a window in every bedroom. You can get a sense of this from these illustrations by Larch Lab, an urbanism and architecture think tank. The left shows 2 point access blocks side by side, while the right shows a typical US double-loaded corridor. The history of how the US ended up in this situation is worth touching on briefly. I'm condensing a lot of history here, but in the 18th and 19th centuries, US cities were uniquely susceptible to fires because of the prevalence of wood as a building material. Outside of North America, it was more common to build with brick and stone. In response to several great fires, cities passed requirements for a second exit, which initially took the form of exterior fire escapes, like what you see on historic buildings in New York. In the 20th century, these requirements morphed into the modern double-loaded corridor. However, since then, there have been enormous advances in fire safety measures, like fire alarms, fire suppression, like sprinkler systems, and fire-resistant building materials that make the double-loaded corridor requirement redundant for small-scale multifamily. Data from places that do allow point access blocks at much greater heights, like Germany, which allows them up to 20 stories, indicates these buildings are perfectly safe. Ironically, the US has worse fire safety stats than these other countries, despite the prevalence of double loaded corridor buildings, partly due to the prevalence of single family housing, which is exempted from many fire safety requirements and has a rate of fire deaths twice as high. The benefits of legalizing point access blocks taller than 3 stories overlaps with the benefits of missing middle housing we discussed previously. For the sake of affordability, reducing transportation greenhouse gas emissions, allowing more energy efficient buildings, spreading housing equitably throughout the city, allowing residents and local developers the chance to invest in the community. For all these reasons and more, we need to encourage small-scale multifamily infill. But even if Flagstaff makes the zoning code changes discussed previously, you still won't get that kind of development without this accompanying update to the building code. And if you're curious what single-stair buildings would actually look like when built in America, I have a treat for you. You may have noticed I said most US cities require double-loaded corridors above 3 stories. Notable exceptions are Seattle and New York City, which have allowed point access blocks up to 6 stories for decades. Because I am way too into housing issues, I have a catalog of Google Street View images of buildings from those cities. Example number 1, the Sola 16 development, is a 4-story building with 8 units built in 2016 on a lot only 3,600 square feet in size. For context, the Flagstaff zoning code prescribes a minimum lot size of 6,000 square feet in most residential zones. Also, take note that it's situated right next to a single-family home. It shows how these kinds of buildings integrate well into any neighborhood. My second example is the Admiral, a mixed-use 4-story building completed in 2020. The ground floor contains tuck-under parking and a daycare, while the upper 3 stories contain 12 condominiums. And my third example is 210 Comstock, a 6-story building with 8 condominiums built in 2018. It's a bit hard to tell with the cropping, but to the right of it is a 40-unit apartment, and to the left is a single-family home, a perfect illustration of how this kind of missing middle housing falls in the middle of the density scale. I could keep going, but I figured 3 is enough to give a sense of what these buildings would look like, and paused for a group discussion. If you're watching this recording, I encourage you to consider your own thoughts about legalizing point access blocks over 3 stories in Flagstaff. Next is a potential change to Flagstaff's engineering standards to enable greater flexibility in the design of residential streets. Why is this needed? Simply put, the roads are too wide. Not just in Flagstaff, but across the whole country, actually. That may seem a shocking thing to say for those who haven't been exposed to the argument before, but let's look at some data. This chart shows the average width of roads built between 1990 and 2015 for a selection of cities across the globe. US cities are in orange, while all other countries are in whatever shade of bluish green I'm using here. What you should immediately notice is that US cities are heavily clustered at the wide end of the chart. The typical US road is around 50 feet, while 20 to 35 feet is typical in the rest of the world. In some cities, like Tokyo, the average road width is as small as 16.4 feet. US streets are abnormally wide compared to the rest of the world because of subdivision codes and engineering standards that disallow narrower road designs. The follow-up question to this data is, why should I consider wide roads an issue? What's the downside? In short, they reduce the amount of housing that can be built and increase its cost. They encourage dangerous speeding that makes neighborhoods less safe and often necessitates additional spending on traffic calming, and it spreads neighborhoods apart, blocking the style of compact development we need to reduce transportation greenhouse gas emissions. But let's walk through those in a little bit more detail. As a matter of geometry, wider residential roads means less land is available for housing and open space. The loss can be significant, up to a third of available land depending on the configuration. The loss of units is especially hard on multifamily development and infill development. In our current engineering standards, these can trigger wider road requirements that deter developers from even proposing a project. Also, roads are expensive, both to build and to maintain, and those costs ultimately pass on to residents. Bigger roads mean more costs. Another issue is there's a direct correlation between road width and speed. Wider roads create a sense of comfort for drivers and contribute to higher vehicle speeds, as can be seen in this study of suburban roads in Texas. This effect persists even with signage for lower speed limits. And speed in turn greatly increases the risk of serious injury or death. According to data from the National Association of City Transportation Officials, a person struck by a vehicle going 23 miles per hour has a 10% chance of dying. At 32 miles per hour, 25% die. Flagstaff has a lot of goals around encouraging active transportation, more walking, biking, and micromobility use on roads. To do that, you need to ensure those spaces are safe, which means addressing speeds and ultimately road widths. When you don't address this at the start, you often end up paying for it later. On the screen is a tracker the city keeps of all the neighborhoods where residents have submitted petitions for traffic calming in response to concerns about speeding. Over 20 petitions in the last 4 years. When these petitions are approved and validated, the city has to go in to re-engineer a slower street. Some examples of what that looks like: the picture on the left is Fremont Boulevard, where the city had to install bollards and street art to reduce the actual and perceived width of the road. On the right is another example from the University Heights neighborhood, where the city has installed bollards and little mini traffic circles with orange barriers in a few spaces. You can actually see 2 of them in this photo. To be sure, I'm very supportive of these traffic calming projects. But the additional work would be unnecessary if a narrower road design was allowed at the start, and the road itself would have been cheaper to build. As for what those alternative designs might look like, it helps to illustrate by example. And this photo is a typical Flagstaff residential road. It consists of 2 travel lanes plus additional width on each side for on-street parking. The thought with on-street parking is that when full of vehicles, it will narrow the perceived width of the road and slow drivers down. However, in many neighborhoods, there is little use of on-street parking, and none at all is allowed during the winter months, so that extra space sits empty and increases the perceived width of the road, which induces speeding. An alternative design for residential streets might look like this example from Charleston, Georgia. The street only has 1 travel lane, it's one way, and only 1 lane of on-street parking. Note that achieving this shorter cross-section doesn't mean narrowing the travel lane itself, for which our engineering standards prescribe a minimum of 11 feet, and that's unlikely to change. It just means different configurations around the number of travel lanes and on-street parking. Here's a second real-world example from Massachusetts. This shows a road with 1 travel lane that is acting as a yield lane. If 2 cars try to go down it at the same time, one pauses to let the other go by, plus 1 lane of on-street parking. You can see some parked cars towards the end of the street in this photo. This third example is from Washington, D.C. This is something more appropriate in a denser neighborhood where there's lots of demand for on-street parking, but it shows a road with a single one-way lane of travel and on-street parking on both sides. You can also just build a residential road without on-street parking. like in this example from Akita, Japan, which is just wide enough for 2 cars to pass each other. And by the way, I specifically chose an example from Akita because it receives about 148 inches of snow a year, even more than Flagstaff's average of 112 inches. It shows that narrow streets are not incompatible with snowy weather if you have the right equipment and maintenance regimes. This was another moment for group discussion at the January 9th event. For those watching the recording, I encourage you to contemplate your own thoughts on allowing greater flexibility in residential road design. In the January 9th meeting, we ran out of time and had to skip this section, but I'll cover it here. This section is not a comprehensive review of parking reform. You could easily do an hour-long standalone presentation on that. Think of it as a small bite on the topic, meant to generate further discussion and interest. The first aspect of parking management is called curb management. Curb management entails all the policies dealing with parking on public land, which includes on-street parking and public lots. In most, not all, but most, residential neighborhoods in Flagstaff, the ratio of public parking supply to demand is so high that no active management is necessary. At the moment, only downtown has active curb management, which is handled by Park Flag and limited to on-street parking on the main thoroughfares and a handful of public parking lots. The goal of Park Flag, what should be the goal of any curb management program, is to maximize access to the downtown area for residents and visitors. Decades of research indicates the way to maximize access is to target an occupancy rate around 80 to 85%, which you do via fees and permits. If the occupancy rate is too high, new arrivals can't find a space to park and cruise around looking for one, generating traffic congestion, greenhouse gas emissions, and air pollution. If the occupancy rate is too low, you're missing out on residents and visitors. The revenue generated through fees and permits goes into a fund that must be used for improvements to the downtown area. At the moment, that mostly means paying for additional parking supply. I won't dig any more into this, as Park Flag adheres pretty closely to the consensus on best practices. The biggest issue is just Park Flag's reluctance to expand into the few residential neighborhoods that are struggling with parking demand. In the US, many cities also have parking mandates to manage the supply of private on-site parking. These mandates exist almost exclusively in North America and became widespread after the 1950s, to which Flagstaff is no exception. The actual code around these mandates is very complex, but basically for any given use of land, Flagstaff has a formula to calculate the minimum number of parking spaces the development must provide. Any development can build more parking than this formula dictates if they want, with only a few limited exceptions, but building less is a no-no. This one-way valve systematically inflates the amount of parking that is built and kills smaller scale projects that can't afford the additional land and cost. It is no exaggeration to say the spread of parking mandates is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, reason that modern US developments look and feel so much different from historic areas and other countries. I'll illustrate visually. This here is satellite imagery of a recent mixed-use development along Butler and Lone Tree Road, about half a mile from NAU North Campus. I'm going to highlight in red all the parking and in green all the attractions: buildings, homes, swimming pools, basketball courts, yada yada. When highlighted, it's apparent that vehicles occupy as much space as people in this modern development. I'll now remove the highlighting and let you absorb for a second what the area looks like. Compare that to a neighborhood built out before modern parking mandates. In this case, the historic district in Savannah, Georgia, the largest urban, community-wide historic preservation district in the United States. The image shown here is at the same scale as the prior, approximately 580 by 315 meters. There are several parking lots in this image, but far less. In lieu of the expansive parking lots, you have many more attractions and green spaces. It's the same story for any other neighborhood that has a lot going on in terms of attractions while remaining a beautiful and pleasant space to be in. From a bird's eye view, the amount of parking will be an immediately discernible difference. Beyond the visual impression, excessive parking created by parking mandates has several negative externalities. For one, it greatly inflates the cost of housing. Recent estimates indicate they cost the average renter in the US an extra $225 per month. Estimates from major cities indicate they inflate housing costs by 12 to 30%. This extra cost is especially hard on small-scale developments that don't have the funds to buy extra land or build a garage structure. Excessive parking also contributes to transportation greenhouse gas emissions by pushing everything apart, requiring a vehicle to get to most destinations. And because surface parking lots are large, impervious, and dark surfaces, they greatly exacerbate urban flooding and the urban heat island effect. Which is all of great concern, but for this brief foray into the topic, I'm going to focus on a different reason why parking mandates are bad. Simply put, the government does not know how much parking you need. It's funny, but also no joke. Going back to that table of formulas for every land use, it looks scientific. It uses formula after all. But I can't stress this enough. These numbers are made up. For the most part, they are copied from city to city with no reference to underlying studies or data. As Donald Shoup, a distinguished research professor in the Department of Urban Planning at UCLA and recipient of the American Planning Association's National Excellence Award, notes in his book Parking in the City, parking mandates are a pseudoscience. Professional organizations have turned against them as well. Over the past decade, there's been a slew of books, publications, and statements criticizing the harms and arbitrary nature of parking mandates. As the Institute of Transportation Engineers said, they are, quote, inflexible relics from a bygone era, for which the American Planning Association notes, a wealth of data-oriented research has produced a growing consensus within the planning community that they do more harm than good. And it's not just the case that parking mandates are bad because they were set without reference to high-quality studies and data. Parking mandates are bad because there is no fixed demand for any development. It is ultimately a variable of the development's business plan. As the Institute of Transportation Engineers notes, there is a wide discrepancy in parking demand even for similar developments, based on many factors that are not possible to regulate. Let me illustrate by comparing two coffee shops in Flagstaff. On the left is Matador, located along Route 66, a major route for vehicle traffic. Matador has a large amount of driveway and parking and relatively little indoor seating. This is because Matador's business model is targeting morning commuters passing through by vehicle and catering and delivery to local businesses. Meanwhile, Late for the Train, on the left, has no on-site parking lot. Its space is mostly customer seating. That's because Late for the Train's business model is targeting residents walking around downtown looking for a place to sit down and maybe work a while. These are both coffee shops in Flagstaff, but because of their differing business models, they have very different needs. And mind you, Late for the Train only exists because the building it's in went up before modern parking mandates. Under our current code, you could not build it, as you need twice as much land for the required amount of parking. This general principle is true across all different kinds of uses. An apartment can unbundle rent from parking to reduce parking demand. A grocery store can do online order and pickup or home delivery to reduce parking demand. A business can give employees bus passes to reduce parking demand. Two developments with differing periods of peak parking demand, like a bank which peaks during weekdays, and an apartment that peaks at night and weekends, can share a parking lot, or one rent space from the other. The possibilities are numerous, but we discourage all that with parking mandates. There's little value in actively managing your parking if you have to build the big expansive lot anyways. There is much more to say on this topic, but for time's sake, I have to cut it there. Hopefully, this brief foray piqued your interest, and if you're interested in further exploration, I highly recommend picking up a copy of the book Parking in the City or The High Cost of Free Parking from the Flagstaff Library. Now, we're in the home stretch here. The last section is gauging interest in a working group. I would like to organize a small working group for a few reasons. One, while I have a lot of confidence in the reforms city staff are bringing forward, I think we're more likely to get the best versions of these reforms if we, as residents, are proactive with what we want. Two, some of the issues that will be addressed in the CAP will involve tricky trade-offs, like Flagstaff's resource protection overlay and infrastructure funding policies. Residents could and should be proactive about what compromises are acceptable. Third, these reforms ultimately have to go through a political process to be approved, public engagement, and a vote by City Council. Even if these policies make complete sense and are well supported by research and case studies, if the public is unfamiliar with them, there's a chance for things to go off the rails. If there are reforms we really want to happen, we should be doing our own outreach and education. I'd like to form a small working group to address these aspects of the CAP. Ideally, it'd meet before February 4th to review the code diagnostic report, then several times between February and the June finalization vote. The timeline after that is more uncertain, but I envision a handful of meetings as specific ordinances go to City Council. If you have an interest in this kind of work, please reach out to me. If you don't have my contact on any other social media platform, then you can email me at tyler.b.denham@gmail.com. And that's all the content I prepared. At this point in the January 9th event, the group had a last discussion on interest in a CAP working group. For those watching the recording, thank you so much for tuning in, and have a great rest of your day.